Staffing reductions, generally, we are currently in the process of about to launch tomorrow a negotiation with staff and trade unions about a senior management reduction. We've reduced our management costs since April this year by £1 million already. So that will be seeking further management reductions going forward, starting that negotiation process tomorrow. We have a redundancy package which we are offering at present. That has just closed to staff, and we will be assessing that. So we're taking very seriously indeed, the need to reduce our overhead costs. I think it's important to recognise what our staffing costs are in all of that, in terms of what our staffing costs are as a relation to the general fund spend. And our staffing costs, if I remember rightly, are in the region of £65–66 million. Our overall costs are about twice that. So we've got a very large payment that we make within that to the HMCS for work that they undertake on our behalf, and that's about £15 million. So if you go into our individual staffing costs, they're not as high as that ratio which you quoted, which I would agree was a very high ratio. It's about half that. Thank you.
Mr. Evans.
Yes, it's interesting you started talking about the staff in there. You mentioned that there has been a redundancy programme and you're about to enter into consultation with the unions with senior staff. You've come in for a bit of stick from all quarters and not least today. What's it like to work at the LSC at the moment? What's staff morale like?
Staff morale, given the challenges that face the organisation, and as you say, you don't get any plaudits working for the Legal Services Commission, working from anybody. But staff morale, I have to say, is holding up tremendously well. We have, as senior managers, been around to all our sites around the whole of the country over the course of the last 3 months, just talking through budget reductions, staffing changes, the legal aid reform programme coming forward, the judicial review, the tender exercise. And I have to say that the feedback from staff has, in the circumstances, been pretty fantastic, actually. So my own view is that it's a pretty tough time for the public sector as a whole. We're not bleeding hearts any more than anybody else, but you don't get any plaudits working for the Legal Services Commission, and this is the hardest job I have ever done.
Would you recommend anybody working for the Legal Services Commission? Sorry. Would you recommend anybody to work for the Legal Services Commission?
I absolutely would recommend people working for the Legal Services Commission. It is stuffed to the rafters full of really dedicated people who actually very, very committed to public service provision. So yes, I would recommend people working for the Legal Services Commission without a doubt. But I wouldn't work for the Legal Service Commission if you were thin-skinned.
Right. Because I just want to take you back. In March this year, there was an independent review of the effectiveness of the Institute of Accountability, Policy Direction, Legal Aid and Transparency of Financial Management. There was a number of recommendations made. How many? It hasn't been clear what was put in place. How many of those recommendations have been put in place and been actioned so far?
22 of the 26 are done, and the other 4 are fully underway. So I think we've really motored considerably, and as I say, I was really pleased to see that the Comptroller and Auditor General recognises that in his report today. So I think we've really motored that as much as we possibly can.
As we've already heard, you're going to become an executive agency of the Ministry of Justice, and I just want to poke around a bit about the implications of that. How do you see the role? How do you see your role change as you move towards becoming an executive agency?
Well, my role goals and the board. It's the. If it were an executive agency within MOJ, obviously there wouldn't be a role for a board. And obviously there are other issues around savings arising from shared services which will affect members of staff. But for a lot of what LSC staff do in terms of managing contracts and so on, that work will go on. They will become civil servants as part of the MOJ rather than public servants working for LSC. Can I say, Mr Evans, I welcome the McGee report, and a number of recommendations were addressed to myself, and leaving aside perhaps the very big issue of EA, he made a number of recommendations about the governance, including moving to a smaller board, and also one that involved the chief executive and the finance director, and those recommendations have been acted upon.
What I'm particularly interested in, do you think taking the LSC, shall we say, in-house may have implications for the independence of the decisions made to fund litigation, especially if you're challenging the government? I'm thinking, do you pluck one out the air and if you prosecutors in Iraq?
I think that is the key issue, and that's recognised by ministers, and there are a number of ways of addressing that. Through an independent tribunal or a statutory officer. There are a number of ways in which you could guarantee independence of decision making. I think that was recognised by the previous administration and by the present one.
But isn't it, if it's part of the government and the government is being prosecuted, how can there be independence? If that's the tension in my own mind, that I'm finding that difficult to work out. You know?
If you have a statutory officer, the decisions of that officer cannot be interfered with politically. So I think that's clear. That's the same in KICA, the Criminal Injury Compensation Authority. They have a statutory officer. The Land Registry have a statutory officer to ensure the independence of decision making. So obviously the ministry, when they bring forward their bill on legal aid reform, they will need to ensure that that whole issue of independence of decision making is properly catered for in the bill, either through a statutory officer or through an independent tribunal. How much input
are you having into the bill?
No, we're working on those issues. We're working completely cooperatively. I'm the SRO for the whole programme of bringing the LSC back into the Ministry of Justice. So I'm the SRO for that, and I sit on the board of the Ministry of Justice now.
One final question: how confident are you about the future?
I think it's interesting. I was at a meeting earlier on today in the ministry, and somebody said, "How far are you on the journey?" And I said, "Probably about 25% of the way." We have got a very, very challenging time ahead. We will be making considerable financial reductions whilst also implementing significant reforms to legal aid in an environment which is highly contested. So it will be challenging. But if we're not confident and we don't go for it, we won't do it, so we will.
Thank you.
That brings me to the point about the discussions taking place now. To what extent have you given advice to the department on those areas from which the government proposes to remove legal aid, in the belief that some of them are better and more economically handled without legal representation, particularly areas of welfare, housing and employment law? Some of these are covered quite extensively by your contracts with CABs and neighbourhood law centres. So you have quite a lot of information which is relevant to how they could provide such a service in the future, but on a non-legal or paralegal basis.
We as officials have worked within joint project groups led by Ministry of Justice officials, and we have input to their work, and we have given them very clear advice around in relation to our views. That's as officials. Clearly, as officials of the Legal Services Commission, our accountability is to the Commission and to Commissioners. MOJ officials' accountability is directly into ministers. So as officials of the Legal Services Commission, we haven't directly given advice to ministers. That has been done through the MOJ. So Bill might want to comment about the role that commissioners have had in that process, because they are appointees of the Lord Chancellor.
So Bill, as you know, your days in this position are numbered in the way you already described, so I'm sure you could feel free to tell us how you think this can be taken forward.
Well, we obviously have met the Legal Aid Minister and the Secretary of State. Indeed, only last week the Secretary of State and the Minister came to the board, and we had an initial discussion on the Green Paper. I mean, the issue about legal aid policy was obviously a very contested one, and this was brought out in the McGee review. My position, I think, has always been clear that whatever our status, ultimately, as someone who is appointed rather than someone who is elected, it is for those who are elected to take the big decisions about the legal aid spend, about coverage and scope. I think we do have, as it were, a reservoir experience we can draw on in terms of what is practicable. And that's certainly the conversation we intend to have with the MOJ. I have to say that some of the issues that are in the Green Paper are ones that the Commission themselves have put forward over the years. Because I think it was our expectation that whatever the, as it were, political colour of the incoming administration, it will want to look at public spending, it will want to look at legal aid spending. And obviously we've been discussing issues such as the role of private law family, should that be in scope? We've been looking at issues such as mediation. And although this is perhaps not formally one of the proposals in the Green Paper, we have, this is going back to the Carter report, we have been looking at possibility of introducing price competition into legal aid contracts. Now, all of these issues have been on our agenda for some time. So as you say, Sir Alan, my days are numbered, and perhaps I should say...
In this role, I was going to say.
What I would be looking for, by the way, is some certainty, because I think, obviously, it's not the happiest position to be in, and I think, particularly for our staff, the government having made the decision in principle, it does need primary legislation, and we'd be looking for this to happen, you know, as speedily as possible. But obviously, it will need primary legislation, which I think the government intend to do via a bill on legal aid reforms, and I think on sentencing policy as well.
Sir Bill, Mr. Howes, Ms. Wayte, thank you very much indeed for your help this afternoon.
Thank you.
We will be letting you have the CAV evidence that was referred to.
Thank you very much.
So that you can comment on that. And then one or two other points which came up, which either you've already said you would write to us or
We
we'll
will.
ask you more specifically to.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Order.
Thank you.